Okay. Hello. I am Bonnie Arning, and I am here to answer your questions. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for reading the book, and thank you for letting me talk to you about it. All right. The first question that I'd like to address comes from Bailey, and Bailey asked if it was possible that this collection is a line of snippets of stories that coincide with my personal life as a way of telling a story. And I would like to say, yes, Bailey, you are correct. So, in maybe 2011 or 2012, I went and saw the poet Louise Gluck give a reading, and she talked about her book Ararat as a novel. She wanted to write sort of a novel in poems that was about her father's death. And I thought that would work really well for the project that I was embarking on. I had written a bunch of poems. I was getting divorced, and I was feeling like it was the thing that I was writing about and writing about and writing about. And so when I heard that idea, I thought, oh, okay, that makes sense. There's a way to make, if I were telling a story, if I were writing a novel, how would I sequence these events? How would I order these things? And so that was my hope, is that if you read this book from beginning to end, that you would get the story of these characters, of, the woman and her husband and her son and sort of her extended family, and see how the toxicity, like a familial toxicity, has seeped into her life and sort of seeped into her marriage and sort of led to its disintegration. So, yes. The book is not entirely linear in the same way that a novel wouldn't be entirely linear. There are places where we flash backwards and places where it, goes forward and then steps back and then steps forward again. So it's not a step-by-step story, but in the same way, I don't think most novels are just sort of a totally linear account of a story either. So, okay. Next question. I wanted to answer Levi's question about the title, Escape Velocity. And he sort of asked how it came about. So, actually, when I wrote this book, one of the very first things that I wrote was the poem that separates each section. So these pieces, like the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, originally that was one poem that I wrote in 4 sections. And it didn't, as I was ordering the manuscript later on in the process, that piece was one whole poem, sort of as like a prequel, not a prequel, a prologue poem, something that comes before the collection starts. But it wasn't fitting entirely. And so I decided to break it up and have it start each section. But the thing about that poem, that overlying theme of the relationship being like space, was something that was really important to me early on. I've always been really interested in space and in science and in our existence in the universe, right? And how it struck me early on that felt like my relationship, like scientists' questions about, is the universe going to expand and then reach some critical point and then collapse back in on itself? Or is it going to expand, sort of break the gravitational bonds and then just separate infinitely forever? So my relationship felt like it was at that point. Like we started off really hot and close and then just sort of moved away from each other. And I was asking the question, will we reach a point where we come back? Or are we never gonna see each other again? So as I wrote the poem, there was a lot of spaciness in it and a lot of space. Escape velocity is, it's in the poem, A Physicist Tells Me, and there's that line in the poem where I say, and it's true that no, now I'm looking for it and I'm not, oh, there it is. That, what kind of comfort is it to know the forces that propel you forward and pull you back both diminish equally but can't disappear? That idea that even if you leave someone, that as you move away from them, you are forever moving away, but that little pull on you will always exist. It might get smaller and smaller, but it will always exist. And not just that relationship, but I think the narrator of the book, the woman who, is essentially me, like one of the things I realized was that I wasn't only moving away from that relationship, but I was also moving away from a family history of sort of dysfunction. And so my question was, escape velocity, like how fast do I need to go to get away? And I think the answer that I realized in the book and that I ultimately realized for myself is that, the best you can do is move away from something, but you can't ever escape it. So one of the central questions of the book is, what does escape mean? I think as Americans, we're really interested in what's around the corner, what's new, how to reinvent yourself, because something better is always around the corner. But probably the truth, at least the truth that I felt like I experienced in writing this book, was recognizing that you can move away, and that's the best you can do. But that those things will always be connected to you and to who you are and to where you're going, essentially. Okay. And Levi also asked about line spacing and line breaks in connection to that part 2. So we looked at 1. 2 is, the one he was talking about was here, and he was saying, why does it look like that? And so when I started writing that poem, like I just told you guys, I was thinking about it like the relationship. When the Big Bang happened in part 1, the lovers are in the Big Bang phase of their relationship where you see everything is really close and connected, and the people are really in love, and they're, when you're first in a relationship where you dream about them, you wake up and you look immediately for their text, and you call them and you want to hang out with them every night, and it's just like everything is close. And so I wanted the physicality of the poem in that section to reflect that closeness, so everything is closer together. There's a density in it. And when we get to part 2 is when we see in the language, but also in the poems in section 2, that the people are starting to move away from each other. So like the universe expanding, the couple is expanding, and the poems in that section reflect some of that tension and that drama that is pushing them apart from each other. In sections 3 and 4, they start coming, the words, the physical language on the page starts moving back, and it's very dramatic, most dramatic in section 4, where she asks if they could meet on, at the event horizon, which is the edge of the black hole, and a black hole being something that would suck, vacuum everything back together exactly, and so tightly, in fact, that we don't even know what's in there, or what would happen to you if you were sucked in that tight. But that's the wish for the relationship in the end, that the narrator is hoping for, is that, as she says in that last section, what if we could fold our figures down into a single speck black atom, every old division then compressed against the dark. There must be enough material in this universe for gravity to usher us back. So it's sort of a plea that the two of them could come back together, but it's also that plea is reflected in the line breaks and the language, and these are the shortest lines, essentially, in the book. So, Levi, hopefully that answered it. I was hoping that the content, that, the physical poem on the page would reflect the content of the relationship. And Christine and Nicole both asked about the poem Science of Sight. And I think essentially you guys were saying that poem looks crazy on the page, and how are we supposed to read it? And did you want people to read it all those ways, and why did you choose that? And that's the one that looks like this. It's like a lot of columns. And for this poem, I meant, when I read it, when I read it across the page. Blind I knew, you the wild melon smell, your fingers against my neck, how violent this longing. Okay, so I read it, from left to right, the same way that you would read. However, I'm aware that you can look at it and you can read it different ways, and that was on purpose because the poem is about sight. Like I said, I'm really interested in science and the way that science validates our internal and sometimes emotional experiences, because I'm obviously pretty emotional. And so I'm always looking for a way to explain that or to prove that, sometimes, essentially, I guess. So in trying to prove that, I was looking at sight. Like, how do we see? How does your eye work? And not that I totally understand it, but it's really interesting if you Google it, look into it, read about it. But how amazing, right? That your eyeball can detect the way, the light, and the instant something moves, that signal gets sent. It goes from your eye, the thing, your eye, your brain. And I thought about in a relationship, how when you really love someone, that the minutia of movement matters. When you love someone, when you spend all your time with them, you can tell by the way they set something down on the table. You can tell if they're happy or sad or pissed off at you or in love with you. And in a relationship, there's a moment when you know that the relationship's over. And when you've loved someone for so long and you really know them, that sight, that thing you see in that moment tells you everything. And it's just a moment. But that if you were someone else looking at that like field of vision, you might not see the same thing. So you can read that poem 12 ways. You can, you could read it up and down or diagonally or backwards or whatever, but really, but there really is, like, if you are the lover looking at the loved, you see it. You see it. It's just, you get it because you love them. So again, I wanted the content to reflect, the form. I wanted the physical form of the poem to sort of help reflect the content in that way. Scott asked me about, and Nicole and Christine also asked about erasure, and they were wondering if maybe Science of Sight was an erasure, and it's not. That's just how I spaced it on the page. There are 2 erasures in the book. One is based off of a Leona Lewis song, and one is based off of an Eminem song. And Scott was asking if the music, if music is an inspiration or if it's something that inspires me. And I would say no. But I think that culture and pop culture is a real inspiration. So part of the project of this book was to look at familial dysfunction, like the history of domestic violence in my family, and then that lived experience in my own life, but also to look at what our culture says about violence and domestic violence. It was when I was writing this book, both of those songs were on the radio frequently. And, to hear someone sing about something so serious with like a catchy tune, and to listen to it in the car and to dance along, and to realize that these songs are about deeply messed up things that are not catchy and are not fun and that are so entrenched in our culture and that are everywhere. Whether people talk about it or not, it's what's happening in homes and to women that you work with and go to school with, and so I wanted to illuminate that. But this isn't an essay collection, and so I couldn't just say that. And so I thought a way to bring that out would be to take the lyrics of the songs themselves and to erasure them in a way that made them sound like a woman sort of asking for help. Okay. Last question. Jessica asked me about a good poem. What makes a poem good? And I think Scott also asked me about, like, why do I write about relationships? Why don't I write about nature and birds and trees and stuff like that? And I think nature and birds and trees are cool. And I like when people write about them who are passionate about them, but I'm not necessarily passionate about them. So I think a good poem is something that does more than recreate or render what's there. So I think that a good poem takes what's there and digs underneath it and digs around it and interrogates it and investigates it and figures out why it's important. What is the essential truth about it? Because as a poet, I'm really interested in truth, and I think that that art is rooted in a kind of truth. We're all humans, I think, and we're all alive, and we're all going through this strange experience together, and none of us know what it is. What is it to be alive? What is it to be a human? What are we doing here? What's the point? Why don't we all kill ourselves? Like, what is joy, and what is happiness, and what's the value of those things, and how should we treat each other, and how should I fill my days, and what will I regret at the end? And those are all the questions that I think poetry answers. Even poems that might seem trite are helping us unravel the mystery of being alive and being a human. And so I think a good poem does more than state the obvious. A good poem does more than say, I feel joy, I feel sadness, that tree is beautiful, that relationship is fucked up. I think a good poem really investigates the why of those things and interrogates the idea until it gets to an essential truth about it. Because to me, the truth is the thing that connects us together. So my objective in writing a poem is, I hope, that someone else can read it and say, that feels true. And if it does, if that happens, then that means that person and I have had some kind of communion, that person understands that there's someone else out there that feels the same way, and that they are not alone. And so sometimes that I am not alone, that is like unraveling the mysterious. Like sometimes it's the mystical, sometimes it's God that we're looking for. But whatever it is, I think art should investigate a truth. When I write a poem, sometimes I feel like what I'm trying to do is, when I get the idea for what I want to write about, I feel like metaphorically, like I duct tape it to a chair and then like beat it with a phone book until it tells me, who it is and where it's from and who it works for. And I think that's important. I think that sounds sort of gross and terrible, but that's what it is. It's painful. Like writing a poem for me is really painful, but I'm a tortured human. And so, but I'll give you an example. So when I first moved to Oregon a few years ago, and I guess it's been 3 years now. Okay, so 3 years ago, when we moved to Oregon, my husband and my son and I, we walked over to this forest that's near our house. And it was late summer. And in the forest in Oregon, they're filled with these gigantic blackberry bushes. And you guys are in Washington, and maybe it's the same there. But these gigantic blackberry bushes, and so many blackberries, you couldn't even collect them all. So we were just grabbing blackberries and putting them in our hands and stuffing them in our mouths. And we left the forest, and we're like, our teeth are all black, and we're so happy, and we're all so intoxicated and just in love with each other. And And I've been wanting to write a poem about that moment for 3 goddamn years. And I can't, because I haven't been able to understand what's important about it. The moment itself is beautiful, but I do not understand yet why it's important, why it's beautiful, what's the truth of that moment. Now that I've been here for 3 years, I've discovered that blackberry bushes are invasive, and that they destroy fields, and that they destroy forests, and that they're actually really bad, and everyone tries to poison them and get rid of them. And so maybe that's the poem. Maybe there's something in the tension between something you think is wonderful, but really it isn't. And so this summer, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to tape that idea to the chair, and I'm going to beat it with a phone book until I discover if that's the poem or not. And maybe I'll discover I've got the wrong guy and that is not the poem, and I'll have to let it go, and I'll have to hunt for something else to interrogate. But a good poem has been interrogated, and it's not just a rendering of what was there. If I just write you a poem and I just tell you that we all went to the blackberry fields and ate the blackberries, who cares? So what? There's no truth in that. That just happened. That's like Dear Diary, we went to the forest. And that won't really, I don't think that's the purpose of art. I don't think art is just a an artificial representation of what life really is. I don't think that that's the job of art. I think art does something else. And I've talked to you for way longer than I was supposed to, and I hope that it made sense. And again, thank you for listening. Thank you for reading my book. Thank you for reading poetry in general. And have a really good summer. Okay.